to his class a few days later that he was up all night trying to think of a response. So the moral of the story is, that is not only the power of questions, but the power of prayer. Another example I want to give you about the power of questions and the power of stories was, again, I was facing a very hostile crowd. You guys are so nice. This is wonderful. No police protection needed here today. I once had to be escorted to the bathroom by a police officer who refused to leave me alone and had to stand right outside the door because of the hostile crowd. So anyways, I had a hostile crowd on a university campus in the United States. And don't worry, they're hostile in Canada too. You guys say hostile, right, Americans? Yeah, not hostile. Fertile, not fertile, right. Okay, so I was on a hostile campus in America, and these students were standing around one of the displays I was participating in, and this was a display called the Genocide Awareness Project, which compares the victims of abortion to victims of historical genocides. The point being, if it's wrong to deprive Jews, blacks, Tutsis in Rwanda of their personhood status just because they differ by skin color, ethnicity, or religion, our point simply is it's wrong to deprive preborns of their personhood status just because they differ from us according to age. So we set this exhibit up, and this is one of the signs that I was standing near, and I was taking questions and answers from this hostile crowd. And one of the people in the crowd came up to the open microphone and asked a question and expressed great frustration at this sign in particular, and said they thought it was offensive. And how dare I compare the victims of abortion to the victims of the Rwandan genocide, when people who've survived the Rwandan genocide would be horrified by this. And so I decided to respond to this student's objection with a story. And I said to the student, I understand your concern that this is offensive because I shared that concern. And I want to tell you about an experience I had where that concern became very real for me. I said to him, a few years ago, I was standing near an abortion clinic holding this sign. And I was passing out literature to people walking past. And a woman came, took my pamphlet, stopped, and began to speak with me. And as we were talking, she told me her story. And I said to these students that this woman was from Rwanda. And she told me that most of her family had been killed in the genocide. And that she was alive because she managed to flee the country before the intensity of the genocide had begun. And I said to the students, meeting this woman and hearing her story in the context of holding that sign made me very uncomfortable. And I started to think, am I doing something wrong? Is this woman offended by the comparison that I'm making? And I said to the students, instead of just assuming and wondering and jumping to conclusions, I decided to seek her opinion and ask her a question. So I said to the woman, how do you feel about the comparison that I'm making? And what I realized is she hadn't really noticed the picture. She had been so focused on me and dialoguing with me that she stepped back and really took in what she was seeing. And she stood in silence for about 20 seconds as she stared at these two victims next to each other. And finally, she pointed to the picture of the aborted child, and she said, that's worse, because at least my family could try to run away. And suddenly, amidst that extremely hostile crowd, you could have heard a pin drop. The students were moved to silence and contemplation because of the power of the story. One final example I'd like to give when talking about dialogue being our method before moving to the other parts of my presentation is when it comes to a poor prenatal diagnosis. A few years ago, again at a pro-life exhibit, I was answering questions from students passing by, And a young man came up to the microphone. He said in front of a good-sized crowd of his peers, "My stepmom had to have an abortion because she was told that her fetus was going to die. Are you telling me that she was wrong?" And I began my response by expressing sympathy for the situation that his stepmom found himself in. And I said, what makes me sad about the experience of your stepmom is that all too often in the medical community, people are told by doctors and nurses that if their child is going to die at birth or die shortly after birth, that they should just have an abortion, that abortion is the answer to this situation. And I said to him, and I'm very sorry that that was what your stepmom experienced. And I said, your question is a fair one, and I'm going to answer your question. It deserves a response. I said, if you'll bear with me, I think I can best answer your question by engaging you in a dialogue and asking you some questions back. Would that be okay? So I even asked the question to seek his permission to even ask him more questions. He said, sure, that's fine. I said, I'd like you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine someone you love dearly who lives in the opposite end of the country. We were in Florida. I said, imagine they live in California, and they call you up today, and they say, I've just been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. I've been given 4 weeks left to live. I said to this student, would you wait until week 3, day 6, to hop on a plane and go say goodbye to the person you love? Or, I said, would you take the next flight out and savor every moment of every day of the next 4 weeks with the person that you love? And he said, well, the second option. I said, me too. And then I summarized my point. I said, here's what I think this says about you and me. What I think this says about you and me is that when we have a minimal amount of time left with someone we love, we maximize the minimal time we have left. We don't cut short the already short time we have. I said, let's take that principle now and put it in the context of the situation your stepmom found herself in. Typically, a poor prenatal diagnosis is announced about halfway through the pregnancy when tests are done around 20 weeks. Pregnancy's 40 weeks. I said, your stepmom, before news of that poor prenatal diagnosis, probably thought she had 50 years with the child she was excited about. And in one moment of being told that news, she went from having 50 years to 20 weeks. Why would we cut short the already short time we have left? Based on your answer to the thought experiment, wouldn't we want to savor every moment of every day of the next 20 weeks with the child that we love? If someone has an abortion, are they going to have the first Christmas and not remember they're missing a child? Are they going to have the first Easter and not remember they're missing a child? No, whether they have an abortion or the child dies naturally at birth, when those significant dates start happening afterwards, they're going to remember the child's absence. So having an abortion isn't going to spare you the grief. It's not going to spare you the sorrow, but it does spare you the time you would have had if you carried through until the child naturally died. So in this culture of encounter, where dialogue is our method, we want to remember the advantage we have as pro-lifers on the side of truth is the truth is written on the hearts of the people we speak with. And so our goal has to be to masterfully draw that truth out of them, and we do that by asking questions and telling stories. The second part of Pope Francis's quote that I briefly wanted to reflect on today was when he spoke about how we are to have fidelity to the one who never wearies of visiting the marketplace. Fidelity to God. John 15, 4-5, we're all very familiar with abide in me and I in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing. Those are strong words. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If we want to have fruitful encounters, obviously very well know this, being people of faith, but it's important to reinforce it when we're involved in apostolic activity and ministry work, that the busier we get, the more prayer we need to take time for, not the less. Several years ago, one of my spiritual directors recommended that I read the book, The Soul of the Apostolate. And there's a beautiful image in this book that touches on one of the points that Mike made, and that is that we are to be filled up. And when we're involved in apostolic activity and ministry work, we can get focused on the scripture passage, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so, because there's so few laborers, we just take it upon ourselves to do more labor and more labor and more labor. And in this book, The Soul of the Apostolate, the whole premise of the book is that when you're involved in apostolic activity and you see how much work needs to be done and how few people at times there seem to be to do the work, there's a temptation to take upon so much work on ourselves that A, we do stuff we're not supposed to do, but B, we cut back on prayer. And the author of the book warns against this and says we become a danger, a threat to the fruitfulness of our ministries if we cut back on our prayer. And instead, we have to prioritize being still and knowing that God is God. Prioritize being filled up. And so a beautiful image is given in this book, referenced actually by St. Bernard, or created by St. Bernard, who said we are to be reservoirs and not channels. We're to be reservoirs and not channels. So if you think about those two bodies of water, channel, the water just flows through. That's like the busy soul in the apostle, the busy person in the apostolate, going, doing, never taking time to pray because no one else is around to help them. And you're going to run out of steam and you're going to do damage. A reservoir is very different from a channel. A reservoir, the water fills up. As Mike said, then the excess is going to overflow. It's going to overflow into our ministry. And that is what we are to be like, and that is the soul of the apostolate. The soul, the heart of any work we do must be, again, as Mike said, that interior life that we fill up like the reservoir, and the excess overflows into our work. So there have been times where people have said to me, like, oh, what did you think of that picture? Or how did you come up with that question? Or where did you ever get that story from? Well, yes, there's something to be said for studying. Yes, there's something to be said for practicing. But at the end of the day, it's prayer. These are divine inspirations that come to mind because time was previously taken to be filled up by the Holy Spirit. Saint Mother Teresa, or Saint Teresa of Calcutta, I do like the mother part, not dropping that. Words have been attributed to her in which she said, I am just a little pencil in the hand of a writing God, sending a love letter to the world. And so, this is why prayer is so important. Because God's holding that pencil, and He's trying to write His letter of love to every individual we encounter. But are we keeping our pencil sharp? What are we doing to make sure if it's a mechanical one, we've loaded more lead? We need to take time to pray. A lot of time to pray. A lot of time for the sacraments. Fidelity to the one. The third part of Pope Francis's words that I wanted to reflect on today are when he said that we are to propose God's offer of love. Love being to will the other's good. Love also being, a few weeks ago I was speaking in the Diocese of Sacramento, and Bishop Soto gave a very beautiful presentation on love. And one of the things he referenced was, of course, a very famous passage in Corinthians we often hear at weddings. Love is patient. But if we ever stop to think of all the descriptions St. Paul could have used, he begins with patience. Love is patient. So yes, as St. Augustine would say, love is willing the other's good, and then being patient with their journey to get to that good place, to get to where they ought to be and not stay where they are. And so it's very important in this culture of encounter that we realize we are trying to win an argument. And that's why we need those good questions and analogies that I went through. We need to be practiced up. We need to know all of that. We need to have strong minds. But it's not just about winning the argument. We want to win the person. And sometimes we can get too focused on winning the argument to the point that we lose the person. But if we have fidelity to the one and we propose God's offer of love, we realize that every encounter we have is an opportunity to communicate to the person we're communicating with, directly or indirectly, that their lives are as valuable and worth protecting as the lives of preborn children. A few years ago when I was in EWTN visiting with Jim and Joy, Jim gave me a beautiful prayer that he had composed in which he wrote, "Heavenly Father, I embrace your grace this day so that I might not think of another, speak to another, or touch another without first looking for your face in the other. I ask all this through Jesus Christ, God incarnate, God with skin, God made poor, God with face." And I really think that should be the prayer of our heart in every encounter we have with people, is to ask God to help us see his face in the angry, swearing, hurtful, hateful abortion supporter we're speaking to, the way we see God's face in preborn children. And to do that, it means remembering the words in Ecclesiastes, there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under heaven, a time to tear down and a time to build. There is a time to tear down the bad arguments, but there's also a time to build up the person, the face of Christ in front of us. And sometimes we have to be willing to set aside the agenda we thought we were there for, which was to tear down the bad arguments, in order to have an encounter with the image of Christ in the person we meet. A few years ago, I had my first opportunity, unexpectedly, to debate an abortionist. Over the years, I've debated many abortion supporters, but not one who actually still currently does abortions. But this was to a medical audience. It was organized by medical students, and they approached this abortionist who said that in this closed debate only for medical people that he was willing to debate. And I thought, well, my debate is going to be the usual, really ugly evidence for how brutal abortion is. I'm going to lay it all out. But I felt in prayer this conviction that all of that would not be for the abortionist, because he sees that every day. He's heard all the arguments. This one in particular, this first one I debated, had his home protested consecutively every day for over a year. But I felt in prayer that I should reach out through the debate organizers to the abortionist to see if he would be willing to do coffee before the debate. And I said in my proposal that there was one rule. And the one rule was that over coffee we couldn't discuss abortion, because that's what the debate was for. That having coffee was to help build an atmosphere of mutual respect, where we get to know each other as people. And I want to weep because I have wept for these men that I have since had multiple coffees with. And I weep for them because think for a moment about a post-abortive woman. Michaeline shared her story today, and how painful it is for one woman to come to terms with having killed one child. Now imagine having killed thousands. Imagine having killed tens of thousands. Imagine doing it for 44 years straight. Imagine being paid. Imagine being under no emotional duress. Imagine being fully educated about prenatal development. Now imagine the pain of admitting you're wrong. The weight of that is so heavy that it seems easier and better to keep doing what you're doing. with every abortion, telling yourself it's not wrong, because if you admit it is, the pain of all those decades seems too great? What have I learned by realizing there's a time to tear down and a time to build up, by just looking for the face of Christ in these men? Well, I learned that one of them, when I asked what motivated him to become a doctor, was that he saw a birth. And he said it was beautiful. Another one I learned had this deep desire to tell me something good about his life. He said to me one day when we had coffee, he said, "I have a story you'll like." I said, "Oh, really?" He said, "Yes." He said, "My first son and his girlfriend, my oldest son, when they were in university, they had a crisis pregnancy." And I said, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yeah, they came and told my wife and me, and we let them move into our house, and they had my first grandchild, who's now in university himself." And I looked at him and smiled, and I said, "You're right. I do like that story." And it was the sense that I got that he wanted me to know that there was something good about him. What else have I learned by taking time to build and be present and to understand where these people are coming from? What I learned is that all of the abortionists I've debated became doctors when abortion was illegal. They were studying in medical school or in residency, and they saw women present at the hospital with consequences from illegal abortions. And it was seeing suffering that caused them to want to do something about it. Now, obviously, what they have done about it is to commit an unfathomably evil, egregious crime. But what that shows is that there wasn't this bloodthirsty desire to kill children. There was a desire to respond to crisis. But when you take the immoral response, then you start to do it again and again to try to make yourself feel better that it's not so bad, then you get stuck. And a lot of these people are stuck.